Hey guys, for something as ordinary as keeping warm, medieval people lived with a problem that was far stranger, slower, and more uncomfortable than most of us imagine. Heat existed, of course, but it was uneven, smoky, expensive, and often disappointingly far away from the parts of life where people actually had to sit, sleep, work, or pray. Before we settle in, let me know where you're watching from and what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. And if you enjoy thoughtful, long-form history like this, a quiet like is a simple way to support the channel. And if you'd like more calm, curious journeys into the past, subscribing is the best way to keep finding them. Now, to understand how medieval people tried to stay warm, it helps to begin with a small correction to a very modern assumption. Cold was not just a season. For much of the medieval world, especially in Northern and Western Europe, cold was a condition woven into daily life, into architecture, into diet, into sleep, and into the way a household organized itself from dawn until night. The question was not simply how to make a room warm. It was how to endure a world in which warmth was local, temporary, and always vulnerable to wind, damp, darkness, and the steady appetite of a fire that needed feeding. That is one reason the medieval struggle against cold can seem so peculiar to us. We tend to picture grand stone halls, roaring hearths, and thick cloaks, and in a narrow sense those images are real. But they conceal an awkward truth. Many of the buildings we now admire for their romance were difficult to heat well. Stone looked impressive, but it held chill. High ceilings swallowed warmth. Drafts crept through shutters, under doors, along floorboards, and down from unglazed or poorly sealed openings. Even large fires often warmed only one side of the body at a time. A person sitting near a hearth might feel their face grow hot while their back remained cold. So medieval people did not rely on one solution. They accumulated many. They layered clothing, rearranged rooms, shared body heat, closed themselves into smaller spaces, changed sleeping habits, carried warmth in containers, and treated cold not as a brief inconvenience but as something to be managed with planning and patience. If we follow those strategies closely, what first looks primitive begins to look practical. And what sounds cozy often turns out to have been dirty, smoky, cramped, or exhausting. For the poor, the first defense against cold was usually not architecture but fabric. Clothing mattered enormously, not as fashion in the modern sense, but as insulation. Wool was especially valuable because it retained warmth even when damp, and dampness was one of the great enemies of comfort in the medieval world. Linen could be worn next to the skin, but wool did the real work of preserving heat. Cloaks, hoods, hose, layered tunics, and wrapped leg coverings were not simply costume pieces from illuminated manuscripts. They were part of a survival logic. A person might own very little, but whatever garments they had were expected to perform across seasons, across work, and often across sleep. That last point matters more than it may seem. People did not necessarily divide their lives into neatly separate daywear and nightwear. Garments were expensive. Textiles required labor. Cloth had to be spun, woven, cut, and maintained. So people often slept in some version of what they already wore, perhaps with added wrapping, head coverings, or extra blankets where available. The modern ideal of an airy bedroom and loose sleep clothes would have made little sense in a drafty house where the fire had burned low and the darkness carried a penetrating winter damp. Beds themselves were one of the most important warm spaces in medieval life, though not everyone enjoyed the same kind of bed. Wealthier households could afford mattresses stuffed with feathers, blankets of decent quality, heavy coverlets, curtains around the bed, and sometimes even fur linings. Bed curtains were not merely decorative. They created a smaller climate inside a larger, colder room. By trapping body heat and blocking drafts, they made a night's rest more bearable. This is one of those details that can sound luxurious until you remember why it was needed. A curtained bed was not only about comfort or privacy. It was a response to the failure of the room itself to stay warm. For poorer people, warmth at night often came from closeness rather than furnishings. Families shared beds. Servants slept together. Travelers crowded into inns where privacy was thin and body heat was part of the arrangement whether one liked it or not. Medieval sleeping patterns could feel startlingly communal to modern sensibilities, but part of that intimacy had a practical basis. Several bodies under shared coverings produced a warmth no single blanket could easily match. In that sense, one of the strangest ways medieval people stayed warm may not have seemed strange to them at all. They simply slept near other human beings because the alternative was colder. Animals, too, complicated this boundary between warmth and discomfort. In some poorer households, especially in harsher climates or humbler rural settings, humans and animals lived in close proximity, sometimes separated only partially within the same structure. Modern readers often recoil at this, and not without reason. It meant smells, noise, dirt, parasites, and a blurring of domestic space that many would find intolerable. But it also meant additional heat. A small house that sheltered livestock was unpleasant by our standards, yet easier to keep above the worst of the winter cold than a fully detached and empty interior. Here again, medieval logic can appear absurd until one remembers the energy realities involved. Warmth was precious enough that people accepted arrangements that traded comfort in one sense for survival in another. The fire, naturally, remained central. But even here the reality is less simple than the image. Early medieval hearths were often open and set within the main room, with smoke escaping poorly through roof vents or holes rather than through efficient chimneys. This meant heat, yes, but also soot, stinging eyes, blackened beams, and lungs exposed to smoke for years at a time. The introduction and spread of chimneys in later medieval Europe gradually changed domestic life, allowing fireplaces to be built into walls and making upper rooms more usable. But chimneys did not solve everything. Fires still required fuel, and fuel was a daily concern. Wood had to be gathered, cut, transported, dried, rationed, and protected from damp. In some regions, peat, brush, charcoal, or other fuels supplemented or replaced timber. Access varied with geography, law, and wealth. A noble household might burn generously. A poor family often could not. And because fire consumed resources quickly, many people learned to warm themselves selectively. Rather than attempting to heat an entire space, they clustered around the source, adjusted household routines to daylight, and accepted that some corners of the house would remain cold. Medieval warmth was often a matter of zones. One warm edge of a bench, one side of a pot, one place near embers, one enclosed bed at the end of the day. This is also why portable heat mattered. One of the most quietly revealing objects in pre-modern domestic life is the warming pan. In later medieval and early modern households, a metal pan filled with hot coals could be passed between sheets to warm a bed before sleep. It sounds almost indulgent, but in a cold chamber it was entirely sensible. The bed did not passively hold warmth. It had to be prepared. Similar logic lay behind hot stones wrapped in cloth, heated bricks, ceramic vessels, and hand warmers of various kinds. These were small, contained pieces of fire, borrowed briefly from the hearth and carried to where the body needed them most. Yet even these solutions had their risks. Coals could scorch fabric. Containers could crack. Smoke and fumes lingered. Bed hangings and straw were flammable. Medieval people were deeply familiar with the danger that the thing keeping you alive could also destroy your house while you slept. That tension gave winter domestic life a kind of vigilance. Warmth required management. It demanded attention before rest, during rest, and again in the morning when embers had to be revived or new fuel found. Food was another form of heating, though not in the simple modern language of calories alone. Medieval people understood well enough that certain foods were strengthening, sustaining, and warming in effect, even if their explanations often drew on humoral theory rather than modern nutrition. Warm pottages, broths, ale, and cooked grains were more than convenient meals. They were part of the bodily experience of resisting cold. To eat hot food in winter was to receive warmth internally, and to do so in a worldview that connected digestion, bodily balance, and environmental exposure in intricate ways. A cold, damp season was not merely unpleasant outside the body. It threatened balance within it. That helps explain the persistence of advice literature on seasonal conduct. Medieval medicine, especially in learned traditions influenced by classical authorities, often emphasized adjusting behavior to climate and season. Food, drink, sleep, bathing, activity, and even emotional regulation could be discussed in relation to cold weather. Not everyone lived by written medical guidance, of course, but the broader point remains. Staying warm was not only a matter of owning a thicker cloak. It involved a whole pattern of living. Even churches, monasteries, and castles, places often imagined as solemn and imposing, had to confront the ordinary difficulty of cold bodies in cold rooms. Monastic rules sometimes addressed heating because discipline and austerity existed alongside genuine physical need. Scribes worked with stiff fingers. Worshippers stood in chill spaces built to honor God rather than retain heat. Great halls in elite residences offered spectacle and status, but smaller private chambers often became the true refuges in winter. In other words, the most impressive room was not always the most livable one. And that may be the most revealing reversal in all of this. Medieval warmth was rarely about conquering winter. It was about retreating from it, negotiating with it, and improvising against it in fragments. A cloak, a bench by the fire, a shared bed, a shutter closed against wind, a hot drink, a dog curled nearby, a bed curtain drawn tight, a servant carrying embers from one place to another. None of these solved the problem entirely. Together, they created pockets of relief in a world that remained, for long stretches of the year, stubbornly cold. Once we see that clearly, the grand medieval interior begins to look different. Not empty, not romantic, but organized around little islands of survivable warmth, with every household member learning where those islands were, who had access to them, and what had to be sacrificed to keep them alive through the night. And from there, the story moves naturally beyond houses and hearths, into the deeper winter realities of labor, class, fuel scarcity, and the uncomfortable social geography of who got to be warm first. And from there, the story moves naturally beyond houses and hearths, into the deeper winter realities of labor, class, fuel scarcity, and the uncomfortable social geography of who got to be warm first. That hierarchy was felt almost everywhere. In a noble household, warmth followed rank. The lord and lady, their immediate family, and honored guests had first claim on the best chambers, the heaviest textiles, the most carefully maintained fires, and the servants needed to keep those comforts functioning. A great house might appear, from the outside, to possess an abundance of heat simply because it possessed scale. But scale often meant the opposite. The larger the residence, the more difficult it was to warm thoroughly, and so warmth had to be distributed unevenly. Important people were insulated not only by walls and tapestries, but by labor. Someone had to cut the wood, carry the faggots, clear the ash, bank the fire at night, rise early to coax flame back from the embers, mend shutters, hang curtains, and warm beds before sleep. The comfort of one chamber usually rested on the cold work of another. In that sense, warmth was a social achievement as much as a material one. A wealthy person did not merely own better blankets. They commanded the effort required to make heat available at the right time and in the right place. This is easy to miss because modern heating has made warmth feel impersonal. A room is warm because a system functions. In the medieval world, the system was often people. Servants moved through dark corridors carrying fuel and candles, opening and closing doors, watching smoke, adjusting spits, airing bedding, and trying, as best they could, to keep a household from slipping back into the natural temperature of winter. For peasants and laborers, the problem looked harsher and simpler. There was less space, less privacy, less fuel, and less margin for waste. Yet small dwellings did possess one advantage over castles and manor houses. They could sometimes be heated more efficiently precisely because they were cramped. A one-room cottage with a low ceiling, earthen floor, and only a few openings might trap smoke badly, but it could gather warmth close to the body more effectively than a vast ceremonial hall. This is one of the small reversals that appears again and again in medieval life. Grandeur often impressed the eye while modest structures better served the body. The poor had fewer comforts, but sometimes inhabited spaces whose proportions suited survival better than aristocratic display ever could. That did not make winter easy. A peasant family still faced the exhausting arithmetic of fuel. How much wood could be spared today, and how much had to be saved for later in the season? Whether rights of common allowed gathering in nearby woodland. Whether branches were dry enough to burn well. Whether dung, straw, or peat would have to supplement a dwindling store. Whether an elderly relative, a sick child, or a woman recovering from childbirth would need a larger share of the fire's benefit. Medieval households were constantly making these choices, often silently, through routine rather than discussion. The fire was never just there. It was always costing something. Fuel scarcity also reveals why certain medieval interiors remain darker, dirtier, and more congested than modern people like to imagine. If wood was precious, one did not burn extra simply for atmosphere. If heat gathered best in a confined area, people concentrated their activities. Winter narrowed life inward. Spinning, mending, simple cooking, tool repair, and conversation were drawn toward the light and warmth of the hearth. The edges of the room receded into chill shadow. Rooms that might seem broad enough on paper were, in practical terms, reduced to the small zone where hands could function comfortably and light could reach. This clustering had social consequences. Families spent winter evenings in a physical intimacy that could be protective, tedious, affectionate, or oppressive depending on temperament and circumstance. In our imagination, the medieval hearth can become a symbol of domestic harmony, but real households were more complicated. Warmth brought people together because they had little choice. That could mean shared stories, songs, and companionship. It could also mean frayed tempers, noise, sleeplessness, and a constant awareness of bodies in limited space. The warmth people sought was communal, but not always peaceful. The same tension could be seen in towns. Urban life offered some advantages in winter. Houses were packed more closely together. Tradesmen had workshops with furnaces, ovens, or forges that produced heat as part of labor. Bakers, brewers, smiths, and fullers worked in environments where fire and hot water were already necessary. Yet towns also concentrated poverty, smoke, and the danger of fire spreading from building to building. Narrow streets, timber framing, overhanging upper stories, and shared walls made urban warmth inseparable from urban risk. A brazier or hearth that eased the cold might also threaten a neighborhood. So staying warm in a medieval town often involved managing one hazard by living beside another. Braziers themselves were a notable solution, especially in places or rooms where a built fireplace was absent or insufficient. These portable containers of burning coals could warm a chapel corner, a workshop, or a more private chamber. But like so many medieval answers to cold, they were imperfect. They produced fumes, consumed oxygen, and posed an obvious danger to cloth, straw, and wood. A person using a brazier gained local warmth at the cost of vigilance. Medieval comfort was frequently of this kind. effective enough to matter, but never free from inconvenience or threat. Another way people tried to improve warmth was by controlling air. Drafts were one of winter's most persistent enemies, and medieval households fought them with shutters, hangings, cloth coverings, rushes, and sheer improvisation. Tapestries in elite homes were not only displays of wealth and taste. Hung along cold walls, they helped soften drafts and made stone chambers more habitable. The image of a castle hall lined with rich woven scenes is therefore more practical than it first appears. A tapestry was art, certainly, but it was also insulation, or at least a modest defense against the radiating chill of masonry. Rushes strewn on floors could serve a similar mixed purpose. They absorbed dirt, softened underfoot surfaces, and slightly improved comfort by placing something between bare feet or thin shoes and the cold ground. In some places, herbs or sweet-smelling plants might be mixed among them, though the romance of this image should not be overstated. Floor coverings helped, but they also trapped moisture and dirt if poorly maintained. Medieval efforts to make interiors warmer often produced new layers of smell, grime, and labor. The room became more habitable only if someone continued to clean, replace, dry, and manage what had been added to it. Windows tell a similar story. Glass existed in the medieval world, especially in churches, wealthy households, and urban settings, but it was expensive and unevenly available. Many domestic openings were covered instead with shutters, oiled cloth, parchment, horn, or combinations of materials that admitted some light while resisting wind imperfectly. The result was a constant compromise. Keep the opening too exposed, and the room became cold. Seal it too tightly, and light diminished. Medieval interiors were therefore shaped by a negotiation between illumination and insulation. We often forget how much the feeling of cold is tied to this larger sensory world. Dim rooms, damp corners, smoke haze, and the slow shortening of daylight. And daylight mattered because winter warmth depended heavily on timing. People adjusted routines to make the most of the sun, limited though its contribution was. Work that could be done outdoors or in better light was pressed into the central hours of the day. Domestic tasks near the hearth swelled in importance after dark. Sleep itself, in colder seasons, could lengthen not only because nights were longer but because inactivity under blankets was sometimes the most economical use of fuel. Medieval people did not simply heat their world. They organized their bodies around the times when heating was most possible. This is one reason the practice of sleeping in phases, often called first and second sleep in some historical discussions, becomes relevant here. The medieval night was not always understood as one long, uninterrupted block of rest. People might sleep, wake for a period, then sleep again. That waking interval could include prayer, tending the fire, relieving oneself, checking animals, or simply lying in the darkness while the house settled around them. In winter, such wakefulness could be uncomfortable and very revealing. A person rising from bed felt instantly how little of the room's warmth actually belonged to the room. The bed had held heat because bodies and coverings made a small shelter inside the larger cold. Clothing for sleep therefore carried even more importance than we might suppose. Caps, hoods, socks, and layered coverings mattered because extremities and exposed skin suffered first. The medieval night was often a battle against heat loss from the edges of the body. Hands tucked under blankets, heads covered, feet wrapped, and multiple people arranged close together were all part of a practical understanding that warmth escaped quickly. Even the shape of sleeping posture could matter. Curling inward conserved heat more effectively than stretching comfortably as one might in a centrally heated room. At the same time, the ideal of warmth was not identical for all bodies. The old, the very young, and the ill were especially vulnerable. Medieval medicine recognized, in its own framework, that age and weakness altered how the body responded to cold. Children required swaddling and careful placement. The elderly could struggle to retain heat. Those recovering from illness might be kept near a fire if fuel allowed, or confined to bed behind curtains. Here, the ordinary winter household became a place of triage. Heat was directed toward fragility when possible. And when not possible, the limitations of the household became painfully visible. Monasteries and convents offer another useful window into these limitations. Religious communities developed rules around clothing, bedding, and access to heated rooms, but austerity and practicality were never fully separable. In some monastic settings, only particular rooms such as the warming house were heated regularly in winter, and even then access could be regulated. The phrase itself sounds almost tender to modern ears, a warming house, but its existence points to scarcity rather than abundance. Not every room was warm. Not every task was done comfortably. Monks leaving a heated space for choir, study, or sleep re-entered the cold with a bodily awareness sharpened by discipline and necessity alike. Scribes and scholars especially remind us that warmth shaped intellectual life. To write in winter was to work with hands that stiffened, ink that behaved differently in the cold, and rooms that encouraged brevity not only of style but of exposure. The production of manuscripts, accounts, letters, and legal records depended on bodies remaining functional in conditions far below what modern office workers would consider tolerable. It is easy to admire the beauty of surviving medieval books without imagining the numb fingers that may have copied them. And then there was travel, perhaps one of the clearest places where medieval people confronted the limits of all these domestic strategies. At home, however poor, one had some command over fire, bedding, and shelter. On the road in winter, warmth became far more fragile. Inns varied enormously. Some were adequate, some wretched, many crowded. Travelers arrived damp, tired, and dependent on whatever fuel, food, and sleeping arrangements the establishment could provide. A good fire in an inn was not a pleasant extra. It was a decisive difference between tolerable lodging and a miserable night. Even wealthy travelers could not entirely escape this uncertainty. Cloaks, furs, lined garments, gloves, boots, and riding gear offered protection. But roads were muddy, rivers dangerous, weather unpredictable, and daylight short. Horses needed care, saddles chilled. Metal buckles and wet leather conducted cold in ways the body remembered sharply. To travel in winter was to move from one precarious island of warmth to another, never fully sure how far the next would be, or whether its fire had already burned low by the time you reached the door. Seen from this angle, medieval winter begins to look less like a season of picturesque snow and more like a long campaign of conservation. Heat had to be found, made, borrowed, trapped, carried, shared, and protected. Every layer of society participated in that effort, but not equally, and not with equal success. One person's warm chamber might depend on another person's walk through pre-dawn frost. One family's ability to bank a fire overnight might depend on wood gathered weeks earlier. One monastery's disciplined silence might be broken only by the practical sound of doors opening to the one room where numb hands could briefly recover. And the deeper we look, the clearer it becomes that some of the strangest medieval methods were not strange because people were eccentric. They were strange because the environment demanded ingenuity from anyone who lacked modern control over climate. What appears to us as odd custom often turns out to be the visible edge of a larger material reality. That reality did not end at the hearth or the bedchamber. It extended into winter clothing trades, woodland law, household hierarchy, urban fire regulation, and even the symbolic language of hospitality itself, because to receive someone warmly once meant something much more literal than it does now. To invite a guest inward in cold weather was to share fuel, food, space, and labor. To deny warmth could carry a moral weight. To provide it generously advertised status. And as we move further into that world, the question of staying warm begins to reveal something larger than comfort alone. It shows how medieval society organized resources, obligation, and privilege at the most intimate level of the body, which is why the next part of the story leads not into abstraction, but into the seasonal economy itself, into forests, kitchens, workshops, and the hidden winter labor that made even a few hours of warmth possible. Into forests, kitchens, workshops, and the hidden winter labor that made even a few hours of warmth possible, because medieval heat did not begin in the fireplace. It began much earlier in landscapes, obligations, tools, and seasons of preparation. By the time a family drew close to the hearth on a dark evening, much of the real work had already been done by hands outside the room, often weeks or months before, and sometimes under systems of law and custom that made access to fuel almost as important as access to food. The forest, in particular, mattered in a way that is easy to underestimate from a modern distance. Wood was not simply there for the taking. In many medieval regions, woodland belonged to a lord, a monastery, a town, or the crown, and rights to gather timber, fallen branches, or underbrush could be tightly defined. A peasant might have permission to collect deadwood, to graze pigs among the acorns, or to cut certain kinds of fuel at certain times, but these rights were seldom identical to full ownership. In practical terms, this meant that the warmth of a cottage fire was often tied to local power. To keep warm in winter, one needed not only an axe and a cart, but lawful or customary access to the material itself. That is one of the more revealing facts beneath the ordinary image of medieval firewood. Fuel was political. The right to gather it, store it, sell it, or deny it formed part of the wider fabric of lordship and dependence. A woodland that looked, to modern eyes, like open nature might have been experienced by medieval villagers as a regulated resource full of memory, habit, conflict, and risk. Taking more than one was entitled to could bring penalties. Taking too little could mean shivering through part of the season. So when people prepared for winter, they were not simply stacking logs. They were measuring their place within a local order. And preparation really was the key. Medieval households that survived winter best were not always those with the grandest interiors, but often those that had managed the long run-up to cold weather with discipline and luck. Wood needed to be cut, split, hauled, and seasoned. Fresh wood burned poorly, producing more smoke and less satisfying heat. Dry wood was better, but dryness required time, shelter, and planning. The ideal firewood pile was therefore a kind of stored foresight. It represented work done before the cold became desperate. A household with damp, green, or insufficient fuel entered winter already compromised. This pattern held true beyond wood. Heat, where available, had its own rhythms of cutting, drying, stacking, and transport. Charcoal required knowledge, labor, and controlled burning earlier in the production chain. Brushwood, straw, dung, and crop residues might serve in leaner circumstances, but each came with limitations. Some burned quickly, some smoked heavily, some produced a weak or uneven heat. What a household burned shaped not only its comfort but its atmosphere, its smell, its level of soot, and the time spent feeding the fire. In other words, the type of fuel helped determine the texture of winter itself. There is a temptation to think that a fire is a fire, and that warmth is warmth, but medieval experience suggests otherwise. Some fires gave a steady bed of embers suitable for long evenings, slow cooking, or warming a room gently over time. Others flared brightly and vanished. Some were better for boiling food. Others were better for quick heat. Some demanded almost constant attention. Others could be banked more effectively. The person responsible for managing such a fire was therefore doing far more than keeping flames alive. They were balancing domestic time, fuel economy, and bodily need hour by hour. That burden often fell heavily on women, servants, children, and the elderly, though the exact distribution varied with class and household structure. Medieval domestic life did not isolate heat from other chores. Fire management was bound up with cooking, laundry, childcare, mending, brewing, and supervision of the household space itself. A woman tending a pot was also judging the fire. A servant laying in fuel for the kitchen was also affecting how warm the room would remain into the evening. A child sent to fetch kindling was participating, however modestly, in the thermal survival of the home. Warmth was a household enterprise, but not an equally shared one. The kitchen, then, becomes especially important. In wealthier homes, the kitchen might be a separate space, partly for safety and partly because the work of cooking at scale involved smoke, grease, heat, and traffic that elite chambers did not want nearby. Yet this separation also means that not all useful heat benefited everyone equally. A kitchen could be hot near the ovens and cauldrons while servants worked in exhausting proximity to flame, only to leave at day's end for colder sleeping quarters. Heat existed, but it belonged to labor, not leisure. This is another quiet reversal in the medieval story. The people physically closest to fire were not always the people who enjoyed warmth most comfortably. In humbler homes, where living and cooking took place in the same room, that divide was less architectural but still social. The best position by the hearth was contested by need, rank, age, illness, and habit. Who sat nearest? Who turned the spit? Who had to rise repeatedly? Who got the warm stool or bench? Who remained at the edge, half in shadow? These were small decisions, but they made the difference between comfort and persistent chill. The geography of a room could become a geography of status. Ovens introduce another layer to this story, because they preserved heat differently from open fires. A masonry oven, once heated, retained warmth for some time, allowing bread to bake after the flames had subsided. In some households and communities, people learned to use that residual heat carefully, not only for baking but for drying, warming, or finishing other tasks. The medieval instinct for economy appears here very clearly. Heat, once made, ought not to be wasted. It should be drawn through several uses if possible. Fire consumed effort, so its effects were harvested with attention. This was true in workshops as well. A blacksmith's forge, a brewer's kettles, a dyer's vats, a fuller's processes, and a baker's oven all created localized climates within the wider cold. But these climates were not necessarily pleasant. They could be humid, smoky, wet, and physically punishing. Even so, they reveal something essential about winter life in medieval towns and villages. Warmth was frequently a byproduct of work. To be warm, one often had to be working or standing close to someone who was. This gave winter labor a peculiar double character. It was burdensome, yet it could also be the very source of relief. Food preparation in winter followed this same logic of warmth and economy. Hot pottages, stews, broths, and porridges were not only nutritionally useful. They were well suited to long simmering over a managed fire, making good use of modest fuel while producing a dish that warmed the body deeply and could stretch scarce ingredients. Bread, ale, onions, pulses, bits of meat when available, root vegetables, and grains entered into combinations shaped as much by climate and fuel costs as by taste alone. Medieval cuisine, especially among ordinary people, often favored forms of cooking that turn time and heat into nourishment efficiently. And this is where bodily warmth, social structure, and seasonal diet begin to merge. A hot meal was a source of comfort, but it was also evidence that the household's winter system was functioning. Someone had secured the ingredients. Someone had kept the fire alive. Someone had chosen how long to boil and when to serve. If any part of that chain broke down, failed harvest, damp fuel, illness, poverty, or simple bad weather, the experience of warmth inside the body could falter very quickly. Medieval winter was rarely a single crisis. It was a long series of thresholds, each one manageable until the accumulation became difficult. The brewing of ale and the heating of drink should also be placed within this picture. Warm liquids had a psychological and physical significance that was hard to exaggerate in a cold season. Ale, small beer, spiced drinks in richer settings, and heated broth all formed part of a winter repertoire of internal relief. People in the medieval world did not articulate thermodynamics in modern terms, but they did understand that the body responded to what it took in. A warm cup in cold hands, steam rising in a dim interior, was not trivial comfort. It was one of the most direct ways to push back against the season. Yet the season always pressed back. Dampness remained a persistent adversary, perhaps even more insidious than cold alone. A dry cold is one thing. A medieval winter full of wet wool, muddy floors, leaking roofs, and slow-drying garments was another. Clothing lost comfort when soaked. Straw bedding absorbed moisture. Shoes stiffened and chilled. Even fuel stores became a source of anxiety if rain or snow reached them. Much of medieval ingenuity around warmth was, in truth, ingenuity around dryness. To stay warm, one had first to stay as dry as possible in a world poorly equipped for it. This helps explain the importance of cloaks, hoods, mantles, and layered outer garments that could shed at least some rain or snow, as well as the use of fur linings among those who could afford them. Fur has often been romanticized, but its practical value in winter was obvious. It trapped heat effectively and could make travel, outdoor work, or cold chambers far more bearable. Squirrel, rabbit, lamb, fox, marten, and more prestigious furs circulated according to region and rank. The type of fur one wore could signal status, but beneath that symbolism lay a simple physical truth. Some people had better protection against winter because they could afford the bodies of other animals to stand between their own bodies and the cold. This is also why medieval clothing must be understood not as a static costume, but as a mobile architecture of warmth. A person carried their shelter partly on themselves. Layers could be tightened, loosened, patched, handed down, lined, relined, and repaired. The poor depended heavily on making garments last. Worn wool could still warm. Old cloaks could be refashioned. Sleeves, hoods, and hose were valuable not because they were elegant, though they could be, but because they extended the body's capacity to endure exposed time. Every surviving image of layered dress, every inventory listing worn garments, hints at a world where cloth performed much of the work modern heating now does invisibly. Nightfall, however, remained the hardest test. Whatever warmth the day's labor had produced, evening threatened to dissolve it. Fires sank. Windows darkened. The impulse to conserve fuel grew sharper. In many households, people did not try to remain fully comfortable through all waking hours after sunset. They accepted narrower circles of heat, then withdrew into bedding. This is one reason bed furnishings loom so large in wills, household accounts, and descriptions of domestic goods. A decent blanket, a coverlet, feather bedding, or curtains around a bed were not mere luxuries in the abstract. They were winter technologies. For the very poor, of course, these technologies were thinner. Straw pallets, rough blankets, simple coverings, and worn clothing had to suffice. Sometimes sleeping platforms were raised slightly above floor level to escape some damp and cold. Sometimes not. The medieval bed ranged from a prestigious object occupying a chamber like a statement of rank, to a temporary arrangement barely lifted from the ground. But across that range, the same principle remained. The goal was not a warm room so much as a warm nest inside a cold room. Even the animal world entered this economy more directly than modern sensibilities often expect. Dogs slept near people. Cats curled into folds of cloth or near embers. Livestock were housed nearby, altered ambient temperatures and humidity. In inns, stables, and peasant buildings, the boundary between human and animal warmth could be practical rather than sentimental. It is easy to describe this as primitive and stop there, but doing so misses the sharper point. Medieval people were willing to inhabit more entangled, less hygienic environments because warmth was not a matter of convenience. Could be a matter of endurance. That endurance was tested again in communal spaces. Parish churches were often cold, their stone interiors slow to warm and difficult to insulate. Worship in winter could be physically uncomfortable in ways modern congregations, even in old buildings, do not quite share. People stood or knelt in chilled air, wearing what they could, enduring services whose spiritual importance outweighed bodily ease. Monastic choirs, chapter houses, and dormitories presented similar challenges. The sacred did not exempt people from the climate. If anything, it sometimes intensified the contrast between ideal devotion and physical strain. Courts, halls, and ceremonial gatherings also reveal a gap between appearance and experience. A great winter feast might feature roaring fires, candles, rich garments, and abundant food, creating an impression of deep comfort and abundance. But that warmth was often theatrical as much as actual. The hall could still harbor drafts, and those at the far end or lower in rank might feel them acutely. Fires in large spaces performed hospitality and power, but they did not necessarily erase discomfort. Medieval elites could stage warmth as a sign of greatness, yet even they remained subject to the stubborn physics of high roofs, stone walls, and winter wind. All of this begins to show why hospitality carried such material meaning. To offer a traveler warmth was not simply to be kind. It was to spend resources to reorganize space and to absorb the bodily needs of another person into one's own household economy. A guest near the fire consumed fuel, food, bedding, and labor. In winter, generosity was therefore measurable. The phrase "welcome" came with embers, broth, dry cloth, and a place close enough to the hearth to let numb fingers return slowly to feeling. That slow return of feeling is worth pausing over, because medieval cold was not only atmospheric, it was tactile. Hands stiffened, feet ached, faces burned in wind, toes numbed inside damp leather. The sensation of warming again could be painful, even after relatively short exposure. Many medieval routines around heat, holding hands near coals, wrapping feet, sitting close but not too close to the fire, warming bedding, drinking something hot, speak to a world in which the body moved repeatedly between cold and relief rather than occupying stable comfort. Winter was rhythmic in that sense, a sequence of losses and recoveries throughout the day. And perhaps that is why some of the most striking winter strategies seem so intimate. The hot stone wrapped in cloth, the ember pan slid between sheets, the hood worn indoors, the child tucked beside an older relative, the servant rising before dawn to wake the fire before the household stirred. These are not grand inventions. They are little acts of heat transfer, little acts of care, control, and adaptation. The medieval answer to cold was often small-scale, repetitive, and intensely local. But once we look closely enough, those local acts begin to reveal wider systems again. Someone made the warming pan. Someone wove the blanket. Someone stitched the hood. Someone cut the fur, spun the wool, built the oven, quarried the stone, policed the woodland, sold the peat, hauled the cart, and enforced the right to take or not take from common land. The humble winter interior was linked to economies of craft, law, and obligation extending far beyond the room itself. And as that network comes into view, another question begins to press forward very naturally. Not only how medieval people stayed warm, but how entire regions differed in their answers, how climate, wealth, building traditions, and local resources changed the very meaning of winter comfort from one place to another. How climate, wealth, building traditions, and local resources changed the very meaning of winter comfort from one place to another, because the medieval world was never a single thermal experience. A winter night in an English village, a stone town house in northern France, a Scandinavian farmstead, an Alpine settlement, or an Italian city residence might all belong to the same broad era and yet feel strikingly different in the body. The methods overlapped, certainly. Wool remained valuable. Fire remained central. Beds, bodies, and enclosed spaces still mattered. But the balance between them shifted with geography, and those shifts tell us a great deal about what medieval people actually considered normal. In the colder north, the challenge was obvious and prolonged. Winters could be longer, darker, and more punishing, and households adapted with building forms that often made more practical sense than the romantic stone fantasies later centuries would celebrate. Timber structures, earth, daub, thatch, turf, and other local materials were not signs of backwardness in any simple way. They were part of regional traditions shaped by what was available and by what handled climate tolerably well. Thick earthen or turf components could insulate effectively. Smaller openings reduced heat loss. Lower ceilings helped keep warmth within reach of human bodies. What modern eyes may dismiss as humble or rustic sometimes represented a refined environmental intelligence built slowly through experience. This is especially clear if we contrast the survivable farmhouse with the impressive castle. Castles projected authority, but many were uncomfortable places in winter unless heavily supplied and carefully managed. Their walls could be massively thick, yet thickness alone did not guarantee warmth. Stone stored cold, and large internal volumes made fires work harder than one might expect. By contrast, an ordinary timber hall or peasant house, for all its smoke and crowding, could gather heat more intimately. Medieval people knew this, even if they did not express it in modern architectural language. They understood, practically, that a grand chamber might look magnificent and still feel miserable on a windy night. Regional fuel sources shaped these experiences just as strongly. In wooded areas, firewood remained primary, though access still depended on custom and hierarchy. In peat-rich landscapes, peat became essential. Its slow, steady burn could define the smell and rhythm of winter life. In places where wood was scarcer or more expensive, fuel economies became sharper, and the use of ovens, braziers, and smaller heated rooms more important. Even animal dung, unglamorous as it sounds, entered the story where necessity required it. That detail is sometimes used in modern retellings for shock or amusement, but medieval households were not being eccentric. They were using what could burn in places where the season gave little room for pride. Climate also altered clothing habits in subtle ways. A heavy wool cloak in a damp Atlantic winter served differently from a fur-lined garment in a harsher continental cold. In some regions, layering and wind protection mattered more. In others, retaining deep body heat during long exposure became especially important. Head coverings were vital nearly everywhere, not merely as markers of modesty, status, or custom, though they were all of those too, but because heat loss from the head and neck was immediate and unpleasant in unheated or underheated spaces. The medieval fondness for hoods, veils, caps, and wrapped coverings was inseparable from climate. Indoors and outdoors, the boundary between dressed and fully protected was not always the same thing. The same could be said of floor coverings, wall hangings, and interior partitions. In one region, thick textiles might be common in wealthier homes, while in another, architectural mass and compact planning did more of the work. The use of shutters, horn panes, oiled cloth, or better quality glazed windows varied widely with wealth and locality. That matters because winter comfort was shaped not just by how much heat was made, but by how much wind and damp were allowed to remain in dialogue with the room. The medieval house was a negotiation with outside conditions, and some regions inherited more successful compromises than others. The Mediterranean world offers a particularly useful complication here. It is easy to assume that medieval people in southern Europe had a gentler relationship with winter, and in broad climatic terms that is true. Yet milder winters do not necessarily produce comfortable interiors. Stone buildings in places with cool, wet seasons can feel penetratingly cold inside, especially when designed more for summer shade than winter retention. A house that protects beautifully against heat in July may remain stubbornly chilly in January. This creates one of those quiet ironies history often enjoys. A region that modern northerners imagine as warm could still produce indoor cold that felt surprisingly severe, especially when combined with dampness and limited heating expectations. So winter discomfort was not reserved for the far north. It simply took different forms. In southern towns and cities, braziers could be especially important. Portable heat in a room not built around a large hearth made practical sense, though it came with all the hazards already familiar to us. Smoke, fumes, fire risk, and localized rather than comprehensive warmth. A brazier warmed the people gathered near it, not the whole interior. Again, the medieval pattern persists. Heat remained partial. It attached itself to clusters of bodies and activities, not to abstract square footage. Urban density altered things in still more ways. Houses built close together could benefit from shared walls and reduced exposure, making them somewhat easier to keep tolerable than isolated rural structures. Yet towns also magnified smoke. Air quality in winter could become oppressive, especially in narrow streets where many households, workshops, ovens, and furnaces all contributed to a dense atmosphere. The medieval town, seen from a distance, might appear lively and prosperous. Experienced from within, it could be a world of soot-darkened surfaces, damp garments steaming near indoor fires, and a lingering smell of fuel that entered hair, cloth, and lungs alike. That sensory atmosphere matters because staying warm was never purely technical. It shaped mood, posture, smell, and social behavior. People leaned toward heat sources. They sought corners shielded from drafts. They wrapped themselves while working. They judged houses, hosts, and lodgings partly by thermal experience. Hospitality, comfort, status, even piety could be felt through the body's relation to cold and relief. A church too cold for stillness made devotion harder. A lord's hall that could not adequately warm favored guests might subtly diminish its claim to magnificence. An inn with a dependable hearth became memorable in ways no written review was needed to record. And this brings us toward one of the most interesting medieval distinctions of all: the difference between public warmth and private warmth. A hall fire was visible, communal, and symbolic. It announced power, hospitality, and the household gathered under one authority. But real comfort often lived elsewhere, in smaller chambers, enclosed beds, curtained spaces, and domestic routines hidden from the ceremonial eye. The public room was where status was shown. The private room, if one existed, was where winter was actually negotiated. That split becomes especially important in elite households, where the architecture of display could coexist with very practical retreats into more manageable spaces. The solar, for example, or other upper or more private chambers in later medieval houses, often served as more livable environments than the main hall. They could be smaller, more enclosed, and better suited to sustained habitation by family members who did not need to perform lordship every waking hour. This is one of the reasons medieval domestic architecture gradually reveals a story not only of wealth but of selective comfort. As privacy increased for some, warmth could also become more concentrated and better controlled. The movement from hall-centered living toward more differentiated household space was not simply about manners or refinement. It was also about the body's desire to escape the inefficiencies of grand communal volume. Monasteries show a related pattern in a more disciplined form. The communal life of the cloister was structured by rule, but even there, not every space served the same bodily needs equally. The warming house existed because the rest of the complex could be uncomfortably cold. Dormitories, refectories, scriptoria, and churches each had their own thermal realities. The body moved through a map of warmer and colder zones according to prayer, work, and obedience. A monk warming his hands briefly before returning to a task understood warmth not as a background condition but as a limited privilege, almost rationed by time and necessity. This rationing helps us see more clearly why medieval people invested such meaning in textiles. Cloth did not merely decorate architecture, it corrected it. Tapestries, bed hangings, padded coverings, layered garments, and woolen wraps formed a soft technology against hard, leaky structures. In many cases, what made a room tolerable was not the wall itself but what human labor suspended over it, spread across it, or wrapped around the people inside it. If stone represented permanence and prestige, fabric represented adaptability. It could move with the season. It could be doubled, aired, repaired, taken down, or shifted to the room where it was needed most. Medieval warmth was flexible in this way, not fixed into the building but assembled around life. That flexibility extended to time as well as space. Not every hour required the same strategy. Morning cold was different from afternoon cold. An occupied room behaved differently from an empty one. The moments before bed demanded different actions than the first hour after dawn. Embers had to be judged carefully. Should they be preserved overnight beneath ash? Should extra fuel be spent now or saved for later? Could a pot remain near enough to stay warm without wasting wood? Was it better to crowd into one room or briefly heat another for a particular task? The medieval winter household was making these calculations constantly, often without articulating them as such. Experience taught when cold would bite hardest and where effort would pay off most. It also taught where the body was most vulnerable. Feet are a good example. Medieval flooring, earth, stone, packed surfaces, timber boards, could draw heat from the body relentlessly. Footwear varied in quality, and indoor insulation from the ground was often limited. Rushes, rugs were available, benches, stools, and bed platforms all helped create small separations from the cold below. But the discomfort of cold feet must have been one of the most ordinary and recurring sensations of medieval winter. This may sound like a minor detail, yet it explains so much. The attraction of sitting close to the hearth, the importance of bedding, the habit of wrapping lower limbs, and the appeal of any domestic feature that lifted the body even slightly away from damp ground. Hands present a similar case. Modern accounts of medieval winter sometimes emphasize architecture and clothing while forgetting labor. But hands had to spin, so write, chop, knead, stir, scrub, mend, pray, and gesture. Cold hands were not just uncomfortable. They interfered with livelihood and discipline. That is why small-scale warming practices matter so much. A person extended fingers toward embers not for leisure alone but to restore usefulness. A servant might pause only briefly before returning to work. A scribe might rub stiffness from the hand before taking up the pen again. Warmth returned function before it returned comfort. At times, of course, the line between ordinary winter hardship and true crisis could narrow. Severe weather, prolonged storms, flooded roads, failed harvests, military disruption, or local shortages could transform the seasonal struggle into something sharper. Fuel that was merely precious became dangerously scarce. Food that was normally plain became insufficient. Travel slowed. Markets faltered. The poor, already living close to the edge of cold, became more exposed still. Medieval people were accustomed to winter, but that should not be mistaken for immunity. Familiarity does not eliminate vulnerability. It simply teaches the body and household how to cope until coping begins to fray. In such moments, charity and obligation gained a more urgent practical meaning. Monasteries, parish structures, guilds, hospitals, confraternities, and wealthy patrons could all play some role, however uneven, in easing suffering. Warm food, clothing, shelter, and firewood were not abstract goods. They were among the most direct forms of relief imaginable. To distribute them in winter was to intervene not at the level of theory but at the level of the skin, the lungs, and the night's sleep. Medieval acts of mercy often appear humble in their material form precisely because they answered humble but relentless needs. Yet relief, too, reflected hierarchy. Not everyone received it equally. Some institutions were better endowed than others. Some towns had stronger charitable traditions or more organized forms of aid. Some lords were more attentive. Others were exploitative or indifferent. Winter, therefore, exposed the moral claims of a society by exposing the body. It asked, in a way difficult to ignore, who could be left cold, who would be brought near the fire, and who had the right to expect warmth from others at all. This helps explain why literary and religious imagery surrounding fire, hearth, and shelter carried such emotional charge in medieval culture. The hearth was not only a symbol of home because it looked pleasant. It was a symbol because it marked the difference between exposure and belonging. To sit by a protected fire inside one's own community was to be recognized as part of an ordered human world. To be denied that place was to stand closer to danger, both physical and social. Warmth was intimate evidence of membership. It also clarifies why the medieval fascination with fur, padded garments, and enclosed beds carried both practical and moral overtones. Luxurious warmth could be admired, envied, criticized, or condemned depending on context. A noble wrapped in costly fur might appear properly elevated, or excessively soft. A monk seeking too much bodily ease might provoke suspicion. A well-appointed bedchamber could represent refinement or decadence. Medieval people were perfectly capable of noticing that comfort had ethical implications. The body needed protection, but too much indulgence could still be framed as spiritually or morally hazardous. Winter warmth, then, sat at the meeting point of necessity and judgment. This tension appears vividly in the contrast between ascetic ideals and human limitation. A rule might praise endurance. A sermon might commend restraint. Yet flesh remained flesh. Numb fingers made prayer harder, not holier. Illness worsened in the cold. Sleep failed when bedding was poor. The practical accommodations that crept into disciplined settings, extra clothing, a heated room, a slightly better blanket for the weak, reveal not hypocrisy so much as the body's quiet insistence on being taken seriously. Medieval society often spoke in ideals, but winter demanded adjustments in practice. And once we notice that, the whole subject becomes less quaint and more revealing. The strange devices, layered habits, and seemingly awkward solutions were not curiosities floating at the margins of history. They were central to how people inhabited their world. They shaped domestic design, labor burdens, moral language, and the experience of class itself. A winter evening in a medieval house was a dense knot of environmental knowledge, social order, and bodily improvisation. The next step, then, is to move even closer to the body, to look not only at rooms and resources, but at the smaller rituals through which people actually used them. How they dressed layer by layer, how they prepared a bed, how they sat, slept, ate, worked, and even bathed or avoided bathing when the season turned harsh. Because some of the most peculiar medieval attempts to stay warm were not architectural at all. They were habits, almost tiny performances of survival, repeated so often they probably ceased to seem unusual to the people doing them. They were habits, almost tiny performances of survival, repeated so often they probably ceased to seem unusual to the people doing them. And perhaps that is the best place to look next, because the medieval struggle against cold was not only built into houses and landscapes. It was built into gestures, into the way a person dressed before dawn, the way a blanket was folded, the way one sat by a fire, the way hot food was timed, and the way bodies were arranged in bed or around a room so that warmth did not drift uselessly away. To begin with dressing is to begin with patience. Medieval clothing was rarely a single decisive shield against winter. It worked through accumulation. Linen close to the skin, wool above it, heavier layers when available, then cloak, hood, mantle, gloves or mitts in some regions, wrapped legs, sturdier shoes or boots where means allowed. Even in households that could not afford abundance, people understood layering in a practical sense. One thin garment alone did little. Several together created trapped air and slowed the loss of heat. No one needed modern theory to learn that the body fared better under multiple imperfect layers than under one supposedly sufficient one. That accumulation also helps explain why medieval clothing could feel bulky, restrictive, or awkward to modern imaginations. We often admire the silhouette of historical dress in paintings or manuscript scenes without remembering that winter clothing was not assembled for elegance alone. It had to let a person keep moving while still preserving warmth. A laborer needed to bend, lift, and walk. A woman spinning or cooking needed her sleeves manageable and her outer garments protective. A traveler needed warmth that could survive wind and damp without becoming so cumbersome that it interfered with riding or walking. Medieval winter dress was therefore always balancing insulation against function. The head was especially important. Hoods, caps, veils, coifs, and layered coverings around the neck and ears were not simply regional style markers. They were essential pieces of thermal strategy. In a drafty room or on a cold road, an uncovered head quickly became a source of discomfort. This is one of those small details that can sound obvious once stated, yet it changes the picture of medieval daily life. Many people were not dressing for outdoors and then undressing fully indoors as modern people often do. The indoors might still require protection. Head coverings stayed on because the room itself could not be trusted. The same logic applied to feet. Footwear in medieval Europe varied enormously by class, occupation, and climate, but winter always exposed its limits. Leather shoes could stiffen with damp. Soles did not isolate the foot from cold ground in the way modern insulated footwear often does. Extra wrappings, thicker hose, and whatever barriers could be placed between the foot and the floor mattered a great deal. One of the quieter discomforts of the medieval winter interior was probably the constant awareness of cold creeping upward from below. This made benches, stools, and bed platforms more valuable than they first appear. To lift the body even slightly from a stone or earthen floor was to alter the body's experience of the room. Sitting, in fact, was itself a winter technique. Medieval people did not simply exist near heat. They learned how to present the body to it. Too near the fire and one side scorched while the other remained cold. Too far and the benefit faded. Sit too low and smoke might trouble the face more sharply. Sit too high or too openly and drafts could find the back of the neck or ankles. A person by the hearth was constantly adjusting posture, turning slightly, tucking limbs inward, extending hands toward warmth, then drawing them back again. Much of winter comfort came not from possessing heat, but from knowing how to use a limited supply of it without wasting the body's own reserves. This may be why stools, forms, and benches around the hearth carried more significance than a casual glance suggests. They organized proximity. They also organized hierarchy. The favored seat by the fire was warm not because it had special properties, but because it occupied the best line of access to one of the room's few reliable sources of relief. In wealthier households, this could become quite formal. In poorer homes, it was more fluid, though no less real. The old, the ill, the household head, a recovering mother, an honored visitor, or a child judged too weak for the cold might be drawn closer. Others remained just beyond the best circle of heat, feeling enough comfort to endure, but not enough to relax. Bed preparation reveals another set of rituals that modern life has largely hidden from memory. In a centrally heated house, a bed is usually thought of as passive. One enters it and expects it to be more or less ready. In the medieval world, the bed often had to be made warm before it could become truly useful. Heavy bedclothes retained heat once bodies had entered, but they did not necessarily begin the night with any warmth of their own. So people used devices and routines to prepare that enclosed space. Hot stones wrapped in cloth, warming pans filled with coals, heated bricks, sometimes warmed fabrics placed among the sheets. These methods were not theatrical oddities. They were a way of shortening the miserable interval between getting into a cold bed and slowly convincing it to accept human warmth. And yet, as so often in this story, the cozy image conceals a harsher truth. A bed warmed with coals was also a bed placed at some degree of risk. Fabric could scorch, ash could escape. The warmth might be uneven, leaving one patch comforting and another stubbornly chill. The person warming the bed had to know what they were doing, and often had to do it quickly as part of a wider evening routine. In a household of means, servants performed this labor. In a modest household, family members did it themselves or did without. What seems like a quaint detail of comfort therefore opens again into labor and class. Even preheated sleep was something some bodies received from the work of others. Curtains around beds deserve similar attention. They are often imagined as symbols of privacy, intimacy, or luxury, and they were all three. But they were also practical engineering. They transformed a large and drafty room into a smaller pocket in which heat from bodies and bedding could accumulate. A curtained bed was a room within a room. Once closed, it reduced air movement and preserved a local climate that the surrounding chamber could not match. For a modern viewer, this can look almost claustrophobic. For a medieval sleeper, it may have felt like the difference between tolerable and wretched. Shared sleeping, too, had its own logic of warmth. We have already touched on this in broader social terms, but if we stay close to the bodily reality, the practice becomes even more intelligible. Multiple bodies under shared coverings produced an economy of heat no household wished to waste unnecessarily. This was true in families, among servants, in inns, and in institutional settings. It did not mean everyone welcomed the arrangement. Privacy was limited. Sleep could be disturbed. Smells, movements, coughing, and shifting through the night all affected the experience. But body heat was one of the few renewable resources available at no additional cost. Medieval households used it accordingly. This is one of those moments where modern assumptions often need adjusting. We tend to think of intimacy as emotional first and practical second. In the medieval winter setting, the order could be reversed. People lay close because the cold made closeness useful. Emotional meanings might grow from that arrangement or sit uneasily beside it, but the physical reason remained straightforward. Warmth fostered forms of domestic and communal nearness that modern heating has made less necessary. Food rituals also become more revealing when viewed in this bodily way. A hot pottage or broth did not simply nourish. It marked the body's transition from exposure toward restoration. A person returning from outdoor labor, travel, or an unheated space often needed warmth introduced inwardly as much as externally. The steam, the bowl held between hands, the slow swallowing of something hot and sustaining. These were part of a sequence of recovery from cold. In a modern context, we might call such acts comforting. In a medieval one, they were often restorative in a more literal sense. The body became workable again through heat received both from the fire and from the meal prepared upon it. Timing mattered here. Households learned when to serve the hottest food, when to keep something simmering, when to draw people inward from work if possible, and when fuel could be spared for another pot or another cup heated before bed. Winter domestic life had a kind of choreography to it. One did not merely light a fire and hope for comfort. One aligned tasks so that heat made for one purpose could spill into another. If the oven was hot, use it fully. If the pot was boiling, feed several people. If the embers were still good, warm the bed now. If dawn is bitter, have something ready for numb hands and empty stomachs. Much of medieval warmth lay in this sequencing rather than in any single object. Even hand-warming could become ritualized. People cupped fingers over coals, tucked hands into sleeves, pressed them beneath blankets, or held warm vessels for longer than strictly necessary because the vessel itself became part of the cure for cold. The gesture of hiding hands in opposite sleeves, so familiar in many historical images, was not merely decorous. It was thermally sensible. Medieval clothing often allowed the body to create its own little reservoirs of warmth, especially when active work paused and stillness made cold more intrusive. Stillness is worth dwelling on because cold changes character when the body is inactive. A laborer chopping wood may stay warm through exertion for a time, yet suffer sharply once the work ends. A monk seated in a scriptorium, a woman spinning by weak light, a child reciting prayers, an elderly person unable to move much, all confronted a quieter, more penetrating cold. This is why winter habits varied according to task. Movement was itself a source of heat, but it could not always be maintained. The seated body required more protection than the walking one. The sleeping body required more than either. Medieval people organized clothing and surroundings with this in mind, even when they left no formal explanation of it. Bathing and washing present another intriguing example of small winter negotiations. Medieval hygiene has long been distorted by myth, and while practices varied widely by region, period, and circumstance, the important point here is not whether people washed, but what washing cost in winter. Water had to be fetched, heated if comfort or health required it, used in a cold room, and then managed afterward while skin and hair dried slowly in low temperatures. Full bathing in harsh weather could therefore be inconvenient, expensive in fuel, or simply unpleasant. This did not mean people abandoned cleanliness altogether. It meant winter changed the terms of it. Partial washing, warmed cloths, selective cleaning, and timing such acts close to a fire became sensible compromises. This is one of those cases where the medieval answer seems odd only if we imagine modern bathrooms transported backward into the period. Without that infrastructure, warmth determines what kind of cleanliness is reasonable on a January morning. A person who must undress in a drafty room, pour or sit in cooling water, and then redress before the fire goes out faces a much more complex choice than we do. The body is always negotiating with the room. Hair and beards enter the story in smaller but still suggestive ways. Hair could offer some insulation, but once damp it became a liability in the cold. Covering the head after washing or after outdoor exposure mattered. Facial hair, meanwhile, could trap moisture or frost under certain conditions, yet also provide some modest protection. These are not major historical drivers, of course, but they remind us how finely grained the winter experience could be. Medieval warmth was lived by skin, cloth, breath, and daily inconvenience. It was not an abstract condition evenly spread across the environment. Children, perhaps more than anyone, reveal the tenderness and difficulty of these habits. Infants were swaddled, held, wrapped, placed carefully in relation to bed and fire. Older children shared adult thermal routines but with greater vulnerability. Their clothing might be patched or handed down, their limbs more exposed by growth or wear. A child's sleep, appetite, and health could be disrupted quickly by cold and damp. The winter household therefore had to distribute attention as well as fuel. Who needed an extra covering? Who should sleep nearest the warmest part of the bed? Who must be kept back from fire despite needing its heat? Medieval care often took the form of very small positional decisions like these. The elderly and the sick occupied a similarly fragile place. They may have required more constant warmth while being least able to gather fuel, tend fire, or shift posture to find comfort. This made them especially dependent on household structure. In some homes, they received priority as a matter of affection, duty, or necessity. In others, scarcity narrowed generosity. The moral tone of winter domestic life can often be heard most clearly in how a household treated its least resilient members when both warmth and patience were in short supply. Then there is the curious matter of smell, which is rarely discussed but must have been central to the experience of staying warm. Smoke in textiles, wool drying, damp leather near a fire, rushes underfoot, animals close by, grease from cooking, human bodies layered in clothes not frequently changed by modern standards. Warmth intensified these scents by drawing people and things into the same small protected spaces. A medieval winter interior may have been comforting to those within it partly because those smells signaled enclosure, safety, and continuity. To us, they might seem oppressive. To them, they may have been inseparable from the experience of being sheltered at all. And shelter, in this intimate sense, often depended on improvisation. A cloth stuffed into a crack, a chest moved against a drafty wall, a stool shifted nearer the coals, a blanket doubled unexpectedly because one sleeper was ill, a pot left hanging to keep water from icing over completely, a dog allowed onto bedding for one bitter night. These are not the sort of acts that survive easily in formal records, yet they are among the most human. They suggest that medieval warmth was maintained not only by inherited custom, but by constant minor adjustments made in response to weather, illness, fuel, and chance. The deeper one goes into these habits, the clearer it becomes that winter comfort in the medieval world was dynamic rather than stable. People were not achieving a warm life so much as staging repeated recoveries from cold. They moved from task to task, room to room, hour to hour, managing exposure, seeking relief, losing it again, and restoring it as best they could. That repeated rhythm gave certain objects and practices an importance far beyond their apparent size. A hood was not just a garment. A bowl of broth was not just a meal. A bed curtain was not just a furnishing. Each was part of a lived system designed to preserve bodily function and a measure of calm in a season that threatened both. And perhaps nowhere is that clearer than in the boundary between evening and night, when light diminished, work narrowed, and the household had to decide how much fuel, effort, and attention remained to be spent before sleep. That was the hour when winter habits became most deliberate, when bodies drew close, doors were checked, coverings arranged, embers judged, and the house prepared itself as cautiously as it could against the long cold stretch until morning. The household had to make one final settlement with winter each night. That settlement was never entirely secure. A fire could be banked, not guaranteed. A shutter could be fastened, not made perfect. A blanket could be shared, but not multiplied. So the evening routine in a medieval home was often less a peaceful winding down than a deliberate act of thermal management, one that drew together everything the household knew about fuel, draft, bodily weakness, and the uncertain mercy of the next few hours. Banking the fire was one of the most telling of these rituals. To leave a hearth fully burning through the night would consume too much fuel for many homes, and it would also heighten the danger of stray sparks, embers, and accidental fire in spaces full of timber, straw, cloth, and dry rushes. Yet to let the fire die completely was to wake into a room that felt almost hostile, with no easy path back to warmth. The answer, when possible, was to preserve life within the ashes. Embers could be gathered, covered, and coaxed into a slow, smoldering endurance that might survive until dawn. In the morning, someone would kneel to the hearth, stir carefully, add kindling, blow or fan, and hope the previous evening's prudence had been enough. That small hope was a very medieval sort of hope. It was practical, repetitive, and never entirely free from anxiety. A sleeping household trusted not in a thermostat, but in the intelligence of ash, the dryness of kindling, the steadiness of a hand, and the modest resilience of a coal that had not quite surrendered. To wake and find the embers dead meant more than inconvenience. It meant time lost, fingers numbed, breakfast delayed, and a harsher beginning to the day for everyone who needed the fire for work as well as comfort. The night itself could unfold in layers. At first the household gathered near the remaining warmth, finishing food, mending, praying, talking quietly, or simply waiting for the room to tell them it was no longer worth staying awake in. Medieval evenings were not endlessly illuminated by easy artificial light. Candles and lamps existed, of course, but they cost something, and their light was limited. Winter darkness therefore compressed activity inward. Once the useful tasks closest to fire and light were done, the house began its retreat toward bed. This retreat had a rhythm. Outer garments might remain close at hand rather than being put far away. Shoes or boots might be placed where they would not stiffen excessively by morning. A cloak could be folded not only as a possession, but as a reserve against sudden night cold or an early rising. Chamber pots, where used, mattered partly because stepping far into the dark or outside the dwelling in severe weather was physically unpleasant and potentially dangerous. Even the simplest domestic object took on a sharper winter importance when it spared the body unnecessary exposure. Then there was the matter of ventilation, one of the least glamorous but most consequential medieval compromises. A tightly sealed room might preserve warmth better, yet complete enclosure around smoke, animal presence, damp clothing, and human breath created its own discomforts and dangers. A more open room allowed smoke to disperse more easily, but surrendered heat. Medieval households lived in this compromise constantly. They did not choose clean air over warmth or warmth over clean air in any absolute sense. They accepted a managed imperfection of both. This may be one reason modern people sometimes underestimate the fatigue of medieval winter interiors. Warmth was often purchased with irritation to eyes and lungs, with soot on surfaces, and with a heaviness in the air that made enclosure feel protective and oppressive at once. This duality is especially vivid in the use of bed hangings and enclosed sleeping spaces. Once the curtains were drawn, warmth improved, but so did the concentration of stale air, smell, and breath. Yet for most sleepers the trade would have been worthwhile. A cold, fresh room is a modern luxury when paired with thick insulation and heated floors. In the medieval world, freshness without retained heat was simply cold, and so people accepted pockets of stuffiness as the price of bodily relief. That does not make medieval sleepers indifferent to air. It makes clear that they were ranking discomforts. It also reminds us that the medieval notion of comfort was often selective. A bed might be warm but the chamber cold. The upper body might be protected while the feet remained chilled. A room might feel tolerable while seated, then punishing once one rose to fetch something from the edge of the space. The modern expectation of even comfort throughout a room barely applies. Instead, households created islands and moments of relief within a generally colder world. One might be comfortable now in this chair with this bowl under this blanket near this wall hanging, for as long as the fire and body held. Comfort was situational and mobile rather than ambient. If we stay with the body through the night, another revealing detail emerges. Sleep itself was a method of staying warm. This is not meant merely in the obvious sense that blankets work better when one is lying still beneath them. Medieval households often retreated to bed not only because the day had ended, but because the bed was the most efficient warm space available once the fire burned low. In winter, to remain up late in a cold room required additional fuel, extra light, and more bodily exposure. To go to bed earlier could be a rational economy. The body's stillness, the bed's enclosure, and shared warmth if another sleeper was present made sleep part of the household heating strategy. This does not mean medieval people slept peacefully and continuously whenever the night grew cold. Far from it. The bodily inconveniences of winter often interrupted rest. Someone might wake because their side had cooled, because another person moved, because the wind found a weakness in the house, because the need to rise for the privy overcame the reluctance to leave warmth, or because the fire needed attention. The medieval night was full of small negotiations like these. To leave the bed was unpleasant. To remain in it might be uncomfortable for another reason. The decision itself was shaped by temperature. Night prayer and nighttime waking, which appear in both elite and ordinary settings, also take on a slightly different cast when seen through winter conditions. A devotional pause in a warm season feels one way. A devotional pause in deep cold feels another. A monk rising to choir in a freezing dormitory or crossing a chilly cloister did not merely practice discipline in the abstract. He practiced it in a body that resisted exposure. Likewise, a layperson waking between sleeps might pray under blankets, or kneel briefly in a room that reminded them in every joint how much effort piety could demand in winter. The spiritual and the physical were not separate tracks. The season braided them together. The same is true of illness, which often made the nighttime economy of warmth more urgent. A fevered body might need cooling in one sense and protecting in another. A cough worsened by cold air. An elderly person or child might need extra coverings, more space by the hearth before bed, or a place in the warmest available sleeping arrangement. Medieval medical thinking explained these needs through humoral language, but beneath that framework lay ordinary observation. Certain bodies fared badly in cold. Certain kinds of weakness deepened at night. The household responded not with ideal environmental control, but with repositioning, extra cloth, and precious increments of heat. This is one reason winter reveals the emotional structure of medieval households so clearly. Warmth was finite. To give more to one person meant, somewhere, giving less to another or spending additional labor and fuel. Those choices might be made tenderly, dutifully, resentfully, or simply according to custom. A grandparent given the inner side of the bed. A child tucked between adults. A sick servant left nearer the kitchen embers than usual. A widow in a small dwelling sleeping with more clothes on because there is no one else to share heat. These are small scenes, but they show how a society's moral life could be enacted through blankets, positioning, and the timing of the last log on the fire. And if we widen the view slightly, we can see that the same logic extended beyond the household into inns, hospitals, religious houses, and lordly residences. In all of them, winter nights sharpened the question of who was entitled to be warm. A noble guest might be offered a heated chamber, extra coverlets, and warmed bedding. A pilgrim in a crowded hospice might receive shelter and some degree of heat, but little privacy and only modest comfort. Servants might prepare warmth for others and then withdraw to colder quarters. The architecture differed, the wealth differed, but the basic pattern remained. Heat was not neutral. It was distributed. Travelers noticed this distribution keenly. A winter inn was judged not simply by cleanliness or food, but by whether it could restore a chilled body. Was the common room bearable? Was there enough straw? Were the sheets merely cold, or had some effort been made to warm them? Did the fire reach everyone, or only those already seated nearest? Did smoke hang in the air so thickly that warmth itself became difficult to enjoy? A good host knew that warmth was part of reputation, and a bad one could be remembered for letting guests remain half-frozen while fuel was spared or comfort reserved for higher status arrivals. There is a small irony here that medieval people likely understood well. Winter hospitality could be most generous when it was least convenient. To receive a guest in summer demanded food and courtesy. To receive one in winter demanded those things plus warmth, drying space, and some rearrangement of the household's own thermal order. Wet cloaks had to hang somewhere. Boots had to be loosened. A place near the fire had to be found. Broth or ale might need heating. Bedding had to be considered. Hospitality in winter was therefore more materially intimate than many modern forms of welcome. One took the stranger not merely into one's company, but into one's heat. That intimacy, however, was shaped by fear as well as generosity. Winter nights heightened the risk of household fire, perhaps the cruelest reversal in the entire effort to stay warm. The same coals that preserved life could destroy sleeping families if mismanaged. This danger was especially acute in timber buildings, densely packed urban streets, barns, workshops, and any place where open flame, embers, textiles, and dry organic materials met under one roof. Medieval people knew this perfectly well. Fire ordinances in towns, cautions about hearth use, and the design of some domestic routines all reflect a culture that feared cold and fire at the same time. That two-sided fear is one reason why medieval heating never settled into simple comfort. A larger fire was not always the best answer. It might consume fuel too quickly, fill a room with more smoke, or increase danger late at night. A brazier in a bedchamber might offer welcome local warmth, yet also introduce fumes and risk of accidental ignition. Ovens retained heat, but kitchens remained busy and hazardous places. Even hot stones and warming pans, among the most intimate tools of winter comfort, carried the possibility of damage. Medieval warmth was always bounded by judgment. The body wanted more. Prudence often said enough. This tension also helps explain why bodily adaptation itself was so important. Medieval people probably tolerated a broader range of indoor temperatures than many people in modern industrial societies are accustomed to, not because they liked cold more, but because they had to. Their clothing, expectations, and daily rhythms were calibrated differently. A room that modern viewers might describe as barely heated could still be understood as usable if one were properly dressed, positioned, active, and able to transition toward bed at the right time. This is not to romanticize resilience. It is simply to recognize that the threshold of acceptable discomfort was historically variable. And yet there were limits. Fingers still numbed. Damp still crept into joints and bedding. Breath still fogged in certain interiors. Winter mornings could still feel brutal. The evidence of those limits lies not only in complaints or medical advice, but in the sheer number of techniques people developed to manage cold. The more ordinary the problem, the richer the workaround. Medieval ingenuity around staying warm exists precisely because the body refused to be persuaded by ideology, aesthetics, or architecture alone. No matter how beautiful the hall, no matter how disciplined the monastery, no matter how familiar the season, cold still had to be answered. Morning, then, was the next test. To wake in a medieval winter household was to emerge from the warmest pocket available into the truer climate of the room. That first movement out of bed must often have been the worst part of the day. Hands sought clothing that had cooled overnight. Feet searched for shoes that might be stiff and chill. Breath met unwelcoming air. The temptation to remain under coverings would have been very human and, for many, impossible to indulge for long. Animals required tending. Fires required reviving. Bread, pottage, or ale had to be prepared. Workshops and fields waited. Prayer hours arrived whether the room was pleasant or not. The reanimation of the house depended on who rose first. In elite households, servants frequently bore that burden, bringing fuel, reopening activity around the hearth, perhaps even warming chambers before their superiors fully emerged. In humbler homes, the labor was less hidden. The first person up became the hinge on which the day's warmth turned. If the kindling was dry and the embers had held, the house recovered more quickly. If not, the cold lingered into breakfast and beyond. Winter competence was judged, in part, by how efficiently a household could make that transition from dormant night to functioning morning. Breakfast itself, where it existed in recognizable form, or the first warm intake of the day, had significance beyond hunger. A hot drink, warmed ale, a little broth, or the first hot food of morning did not simply begin the day nutritionally. It signaled that the household had regained control over fire and therefore over time. Once the hearth or oven was active again, tasks could branch outward from it. Cold hands could soften. Water could be heated. Dough could be managed. The room became a workplace as much as a refuge. This morning revival was especially important in craft settings. A smith needed a forge properly alive, a baker an oven at the right stage of heat, a brewer or dyer the ability to manage temperatures through labor rather than merely survive them. In that sense, the medieval workday in winter often began with thermal preparation before productive work could fully proceed. Heat was not background. It was a precondition. The person who controlled it controlled the pace of everything else. There is, quietly, a broader historical point here. The pre-modern world was organized less around stable environments than around strategic warm points. The hearth, the oven, the forge, the bakehouse, the bed, the body, the animal shelter, the thick garment, the curtained enclosure. These points created a map of survival across the day. People moved among them, borrowed from them, and planned around them. Much of what appears to us as strange medieval behavior becomes understandable once we stop imagining warmth as a room-sized condition and start imagining it as a scarce local resource. The rhythm of winter laundry offers a good example. Washing cloth in cold weather involved water, drying time, access to heat, and the risk of ending with damp garments that were more dangerous than dirt. So laundry had to be timed carefully, often around the strongest available heat sources or more favorable weather intervals. The same was true for bathing, childbirth preparations, convalescence, and even some aspects of food preservation. Many domestic decisions that seem unrelated to heating were in fact deeply entangled with it. A cold season reorganized the whole household not only because people wanted to feel warm, but because nearly every practical activity was made harder by the lack of easy heat. This entanglement extended outward into the calendar itself. Winter feasts, saints' days, and communal gatherings often took place against a physical backdrop that made indoor assembly meaningful in a very literal way. Food was richer when available. Fires were more central. Shared drink mattered more. Festivity in winter did not float above material conditions. It responded to them. The warmth of a feast was social, spiritual, and thermal at once. That is one reason festive interiors loom so vividly in memory. They offered a temporary intensification of what people sought all season: light, heat, company, and a feeling that the cold had been pushed back, however briefly. But the pushback was always temporary. The fire sank again. Guests departed. The hall cooled. The ordinary household resumed its quieter bargain with winter. And in that quieter bargain, some of the most revealing medieval strategies appeared not in moments of celebration, but in the routine endurance of ordinary days, the repeated use of furs and padding, the calculated warming of beds, the handling of coals, the timing of hot meals, the sharing of sleeping space, the choice to live closer to animals or closer to one another than modern standards would permit, all because the climate and the available technologies left little alternative. Which is why the story now begins to edge toward one of its deepest questions. Not simply how medieval people stayed warm, but how much cold they were expected to endure as normal, and how that expectation changed according to rank, gender, age, work, and setting. Because once we ask that, the seemingly simple matter of winter comfort becomes a map of inequality written directly onto the body, from the lord in a curtained bed to the laborer dressing before dawn in clothes that had never fully dried from the day before, from the lord in a curtained bed to the laborer dressing before dawn in clothes that had never fully dried from the day before. Cold was not distributed evenly, and medieval people knew that perfectly well. The body itself became a record of rank. Not in some abstract symbolic sense, but in the simplest possible way. Who woke warm, who woke stiff, who could stay near a hearth, who had to leave it, who wore fur, who wore patched wool, who sat in a private chamber, and who crossed a dark yard before sunrise because the animals, the kitchen, or the workshop could not wait. This is where the subject becomes quietly more serious than it first appears. To ask how medieval people stayed warm is also to ask how much discomfort they were expected to accept without complaint. Every society sets a threshold for what counts as ordinary hardship. In the medieval world, that threshold varied sharply by class and circumstance. A noble household might still struggle with drafty stone rooms and imperfect heating, but it had textiles, servants, enclosed beds, multiple chambers, and fuel reserves that transformed the very meaning of difficulty. By contrast, a caretaker or servant might live so close to recurring cold that warmth was not a stable condition at all, only an interruption of discomfort. Servants make this especially clear. They moved constantly through the thermal boundaries of the household. A maid could warm a chamber for her mistress, then return to colder quarters. A boy might rise early to fetch fuel, entering the day through the worst of the morning chill, so that others might wake into relative comfort. Kitchen servants worked beside heat, but did not necessarily possess leisure within it. That distinction matters. Heat near the body is not always comfort if the body is also standing, carrying, turning spits, hauling water, scrubbing vessels, and remaining answerable to someone else's schedule. Medieval service often meant proximity to warmth without ownership of it. This is one of the most revealing reversals in the whole story. The people most involved in producing warmth were often the least free to enjoy it. The person banking the fire, hauling the peat, drawing the bath, warming the bed, baking the bread, or tending the oven served as a kind of human infrastructure for someone else's winter ease. That labor was rarely invisible to contemporaries, but it was accepted as part of the order of things. And because it was accepted, medieval warmth becomes an unusually intimate expression of hierarchy. It did not only shape what people wore or where they slept. It shaped whose body absorbed the inconvenience necessary to spare another's. Gender, too, enters the story here, though not in a simple or universal way. Women's winter experiences differed according to class, marital status, pregnancy, domestic role, and local custom, but many of the tasks bound up with household warmth fell heavily into female spheres of responsibility. Cooking, textile management, childcare, overseeing bedding, drying garments, timing hot food, and monitoring the small domestic adjustments that made a room livable. In a prosperous household, that oversight might be managerial rather than wholly physical. In a poorer one, it was often direct and exhausting. Either way, women frequently stood at the center of winter maintenance, not because they were passive inhabitants of the home, but because the home itself was an active thermal system requiring constant care. Pregnancy and childbirth sharpened these realities further. A woman near childbirth, or recovering from it, needed protection from cold that many medical and domestic traditions took seriously. Warm rooms, warmed linens, bed rest, broths, and controlled exposure mattered. Yet the ability to provide such care depended entirely on household means. In elite settings, lying in chambers could be arranged with relative attention to warmth and enclosure. In poorer settings, the same bodily vulnerability met rougher conditions. Winter therefore amplified existing inequalities at some of the most physically precarious moments in life. The very young and the very old faced similar exposure to household fortune. An infant could not layer garments thoughtfully, seek out the least drafty corner, or bank a fire. An elderly person with stiff joints and reduced strength could not always gather heat efficiently for themselves. Both were dependent on the judgment and capacity of others. And because medieval households were often multigenerational or at least densely inhabited, the question of who needed protection most became part of daily practical ethics. A grandmother closer to the embers, a child sleeping between adults, an invalid moved to the inner side of the bed. These were not sentimental flourishes. They were bodily strategies shaped by necessity and relationship. Work, perhaps even more than rank, determined how cold was encountered hour by hour. Outdoor laborers faced one kind of winter, indoor artisans another, monks and clerks another again. A plowman or woodcutter might begin the day freezing, then warm through exertion, only to feel the cold return sharply during pauses or after sunset. A spinner or scribe could remain chilled for longer because the work itself generated less bodily heat. A blacksmith might sweat near the forge and then step into cutting air. The medieval body repeatedly crossed thresholds between hot, cold, damp, smoky, and wind-struck spaces. This constant crossing is easy to overlook if we picture life in static categories: indoors versus outdoors, rich versus poor. The reality was more fluid and often more wearing. There is also a difference between chosen discomfort and imposed discomfort. A lord hunting in winter might feel bitter cold, but within a framework of status, sport, and likely recovery afterward in better quarters. A messenger riding through sleet felt cold in service to obligation. A poor woman collecting brushwood felt cold because fuel had to be found somehow. The physical sensation may overlap, but its social meaning does not. Medieval life was full of cold bodies, yet not all cold carried the same implications. Some forms of exposure were temporary demonstrations of vigor or duty. Others were the ordinary tax paid by people with few buffers between themselves and the season. Religious life offered its own version of this distinction. Ascetic ideals sometimes praised endurance, self-restraint, and distance from bodily indulgence. But, as before, winter reveals how theory met the body's limits. A saint's life might celebrate endurance of cold as evidence of holiness. A monastic rule might assume modest heating. Yet ordinary religious communities still had to keep enough warmth in circulation to prevent the collapse of health, discipline, and labor. The medieval world could admire hardship while also managing it carefully. That tension between idealized endurance and practical concession appears again and again, and winter makes it visible in almost every institution. Medical thinking did the same in its own vocabulary. Learned medicine, drawing on classical traditions, often described bodies as differently disposed toward heat and cold. Age, complexion, sex, illness, season, and diet all shaped what kind of warming was recommended or feared. Medieval advice could therefore become quite nuanced, though not always in ways that map neatly onto modern science. Certain foods were warming. Certain activities generated beneficial heat. Certain bodies needed protection from damp and wind. Even when the underlying theory differs from ours, the attention to gradation is striking. Medieval people did not treat cold as a single blunt force affecting everyone identically. They observed that some suffered more, recovered more slowly, or required different forms of care. That observation could also become moralized. To be too delicate might invite criticism in some settings, especially among elites or religious communities where toughness had symbolic value. Yet, genuine inability to withstand cold was also recognized. An old body, a sick body, a child's body, or a woman in labor was not expected to meet the season on the same terms as a healthy adult man at work. Medieval society could be harsh, but it was not wholly blind. What matters is that compassion, duty, and status all influenced whether bodily vulnerability actually translated into more warmth. One subtle but important effect of all this was that winter comfort itself became a marker of refinement. Not warmth in the basic sense of not freezing, but cultivated warmth. Lined garments, layered bed hangings, rugs or carpets where they could be afforded, enclosed chambers, well-fitted shutters, carefully timed meals, domestic servants attentive to embers and bedding, and an interior atmosphere deliberately softened against draft and damp. The more elite the setting, the more winter could be transformed from a blunt environmental fact into something managed, staged, and moderated. Yet that same refinement often rested on an army of less comfortable bodies making it possible. This is why medieval luxury so often hides labor. A fur-lined mantle suggests status, but also trapping, trade, preparation, and money. A warm chamber implies fuel supply, servants, and architecture tailored to selective comfort. A rich winter feast means kitchens running hot while workers chop, stir, bake, and carry. Even the lord reclining in comparative ease remains, in a sense, surrounded by the bodies that absorb his cold for him. The history of staying warm is, unexpectedly, one of the clearest ways to see how intimate inequality can be. The poor, by contrast, lived closer to the failure point. When fuel ran low, when weather worsened, when clothing stayed damp too long, when illness prevented labor, the margin between discomfort and danger narrowed quickly. A household that was merely cold in an ordinary week could become dangerously cold in a bad one. This is why winter aid mattered so much and why rights to woodland, gleaning, common pasture, peat cutting, and access to local charity were not peripheral details. They were part of the thermal safety net of the poor. Without them, the home lost some of its capacity to resist the season at all. Urban poverty could be especially cruel in this respect. Towns offered work, markets, and denser shelter, but they also concentrated rents, crowding, and social vulnerability. A poor family in a town might live in cramped quarters with thin walls, limited private fuel, and little ability to control the structure around them. Shared walls could help, but they could not compensate for poverty's broader effects. In such places, staying warm often meant making do with lesser fuel, making rooms multipurpose, sharing beds more tightly, and enduring more smoke, more smell, and more bodily compression than richer neighbors nearby. And yet, the urban environment could also produce strange little inequalities of warmth. A baker might live over or beside an oven and benefit indirectly from retained heat. A metal worker might have access to intermittent high temperatures but still sleep in a poorly heated room. A tavern keeper presided over a warm common space but had no guarantee of quiet rest. Warmth, in other words, did not map neatly onto wealth alone. Occupation, building type, and proximity to work mattered too. Some poor people may occasionally have inhabited warmer microenvironments than some middling ones, though without the security, cleanliness, or privacy that made warmth comfortable in the fuller sense. Climate could sharpen these distinctions even within the same region. A harsh winter exposed differences that a milder season allowed people to ignore. The household with good stores, solid clothing, and adaptable rooms rode out the season with inconvenience. The one living close to the edge experienced the same weather as a sequence of physical tests. In this way, cold served as a kind of social revealer. It made visible what prosperity and poverty meant at the level of the lungs and joints. Medieval people did not need statistical measures to understand inequality when it could be felt in the contrast between a smoky one-room hut and a well-draped chamber across the same village or town. This bodily visibility also shaped imagination and language. Tales, sermons, and moral instructions that used fire, hearth, nakedness, frost, fur, or shelter as symbols worked because listeners knew exactly what such things felt like. The danger of exposure, the relief of heat, the shame of ragged clothing, the prestige of rich winter garments, the welcome of a bed already warmed. These were not distant metaphors. They were common experiences calibrated differently by rank. Medieval culture could therefore load them with moral and emotional force because the physical realities were so immediate. And then there were those who stood somewhat outside ordinary household protection altogether. The itinerant poor, some pilgrims, displaced people, casual laborers between employments, and the homeless in urban settings. Their winter strategies could be especially precarious: crowded shelters, church porches, hospices when available, makeshift coverings, dependency on alms, on fires shared with others, on the goodwill of institutions or strangers. This edge of society is harder to recover in detail, but precisely for that reason it deserves attention. The medieval world was not entirely contained within orderly households. There were always people for whom warmth existed only temporarily, borrowed rather than possessed. That borrowed quality perhaps helps explain the moral prestige of hospitality and almsgiving in winter. To give warmth was to give something both basic and difficult to supply. A loaf of bread could be handed over once. Ongoing warmth required space, fuel, and tolerance. To admit another person into one's firelit circle was a more intimate form of charity than simply dispensing food outdoors. It asked the household to loosen its boundaries. The fact that medieval culture so often praised such acts is telling. It suggests that people recognized how much was being given. At the same time, winter also exposed fear of burden. An extra person near the fire meant more fuel consumed, more bedding needed, more air fouled, more disorder in a space already under pressure. Medieval charity was real, but so were medieval limits. The poor knew this. Institutions knew it. Households knew it. And because everyone knew it, the arrival of cold weather likely carried not just practical concern but social tension. Who might need help this year? Who could provide it? Who would be left to endure more than was fair, or more than was survivable? All of this complicates the appealing image of medieval winter as simply communal. It was communal, yes, in the sense that bodies gathered, fires drew people together, and households shared space intensively. But that communality could be unequal, strained, and enforced by necessity. One person's warmth could depend on another's service. One family's survival could depend on access denied to another. Crowding could comfort or exhaust. Shared sleeping could preserve life or erode dignity. The medieval answer to cold was often collective, but not always gentle. If anything, that is what makes the story more human and more trustworthy. Warmth was not romantic. It was negotiated. It carried moral weight because it was scarce enough to matter. It revealed hierarchy because the body cannot conceal discomfort well. And it created a world in which small privileges, a thicker blanket, a spot nearer the hearth, a better hood, a servant who revived the fire before dawn, became deeply significant. Seen this way, some of the supposedly strange medieval attempts to stay warm stop looking eccentric and start looking almost inevitable. Of course people slept together. Of course they layered wool until movement felt cumbersome. Of course they prized curtains, furs, padded coverings, and portable heat. Of course they accepted smoke, smell, and crowding that modern people would reject. Those choices were not evidence of odd taste. They were the logical outcomes of a world where climate control barely existed and the body remained stubbornly, repeatedly vulnerable. And yet one important dimension still remains to be examined more closely, because up to this point we have mostly followed ordinary patterns, habit, hierarchy, daily routine. But winter in the medieval world was not only endured through normal domestic practice. It was also confronted through invention, regional experiment, and a whole range of objects and tricks that could seem surprisingly ingenious, surprisingly uncomfortable, or both at once. Once we move from the body and the household into the tools themselves, the story becomes even stranger. Metal bed warmers, foot stoves, heated stones, ceramic containers, layered wall textiles, portable braziers, and all the awkward little technologies people used to carry fragments of the hearth into places the hearth could not reach. Metal bed warmers, foot stoves, heated stones, ceramic containers, layered wall textiles, portable braziers, and all the awkward little technologies people used to carry fragments of the hearth into places the hearth could not reach. This is where medieval winter starts to feel especially intimate and inventive, because the central problem was so clear. A fixed fire could only do so much. It warmed the room unevenly, consumed fuel constantly, and tied comfort to one location. But people needed warmth in bed, at prayer, at work tables, in side chambers, on benches, under cloaks, near aching feet, and sometimes in spaces where a full hearth was impossible or impractical. So they developed ways of borrowing heat, containing it briefly, and moving it through the house like a fragile treasure. The bed warmer is perhaps the most famous of these objects, and with good reason because it captures so much of the medieval and early pre-modern logic at once. A shallow metal pan, often with a long handle and filled with hot coals, could be passed through the bedding before sleep to drive away the worst of the cold. In a large, chilly chamber, this must have felt less like luxury than like mercy. The first touch of a warmed sheet in winter is one of those bodily experiences that needs little explanation across centuries. Yet, as always, the relief came with drawbacks. Coals shed ash. Metal held dangerous heat. Fabrics could scorch. A person warming a bed had to move with care, patience, and a kind of practiced confidence. There was no room for the thoughtless ease modern heating encourages. And even here, social difference remained visible. In a wealthy household, bed warming might be routine, performed by servants as part of the nightly preparation of private chambers. In humbler settings, heated stones or bricks wrapped in cloth could serve a similar purpose more simply and more cheaply. A brick left near the fire, then transferred carefully beneath blankets or toward the foot of the bed, turned masonry into temporary stored heat. One can almost picture the sequence. The evening fire lowered to embers, the brick judged hot enough but not too hot, the bedclothes lifted, the warmth inserted like a secret reserve against the night. Such techniques were ingenious precisely because they used familiar materials. The medieval household often solved problems not with elaborate machines, but with ordinary substances moved at the right time. Heated stones worked in much the same way. Smooth stones placed near coals, then wrapped and carried, could warm bedding, hands, laps, or feet. They were simple, cheap, and effective enough to persist in various forms for centuries. Yet even the stone warmer reminds us of how partial medieval comfort remained. The stone did not warm the whole bed, only one area for a while. It did not eliminate the cold room beyond the blanket. It created a local pocket of relief, just as the curtain, the cloak, and the hearth did. Again and again, the medieval answer to winter was not total environmental control, but concentration. Heat was gathered and focused where the body most urgently needed it. Feet, in particular, inspired their own class of solutions. Anyone who has ever felt cold rising through the soles knows how persistent and demoralizing it can be, and in the medieval world cold feet were more than an annoyance. They were an ordinary fact of stone floors, packed earth, damp leather, thin soles, and winter stillness. So people used foot warmers, stools near the fire, wrapped bricks, layered hose, rush-covered floors, furs under benches, and later devices resembling enclosed foot stoves or small heated containers. Even where the exact object varied by region and period, the principle remained stable. Warm the extremities or the body never really feels restored. This may seem like a minor domestic concern, but it reveals something deep about the medieval experience of cold. Comfort was often felt first at the edges of the body. A person could endure a cool room if the feet were protected, if the hands could recover, if the face was not in wind, if the bed was tolerable, if the chest and neck were kept warm beneath layers. That is why so many historical warming devices are not room-based but body-based. They are aimed at particular parts of the human frame. Medieval people did not merely heat spaces. They targeted bodily weakness. Portable braziers make this especially clear. A brazier could bring coals into an otherwise unheated chamber, under a table, beside a chair, or into a setting where built fireplaces were lacking or insufficient. In some regions and later medieval or early modern contexts, braziers became central to daily life, especially in climates where houses were not designed around the deep, enclosed hearth culture of Northern Europe. Yet the brazier is a perfect symbol of the trade-offs woven through the whole subject. Provided warmth that could move. It also produced smoke, fumes, dryness for the skin, soot, and continual risk. Its usefulness depended on good judgment, partial ventilation, and experience. A brazier solved one problem only by demanding watchfulness against several others. The same pattern appears in hand warmers and lap warmers, small containers or cloth-wrapped heat sources intended to sustain localized comfort while sitting, sewing, writing, praying, or traveling. These are the sort of objects that can seem charming in a museum case and slightly absurd in a modern imagination. But once placed back in the texture of medieval life, they look far more sensible. If a scribe's hands stiffen, if a woman spinning cannot feel her fingers well, if a noblewoman seated in a cold chamber needs to remain still for long periods, if an older person cannot easily keep warm through movement alone, then a portable reservoir of heat becomes not decorative but practical. There is something quietly revealing in this portability. It suggests a world in which bodies were expected to move into cold spaces and bring their warmth solutions with them. The room would not be changed for them. They would carry the answer in a pan, a stone, a brazier, a cloak, a fur muff, or a layering of textiles. Medieval comfort, then, was often personal rather than architectural. The building might remain imperfect. The individual adapted around that imperfection with objects that made the body more resilient. Textiles themselves were among the most sophisticated of these technologies, even if they do not always look like technology in the modern sense. A heavy tapestry on a wall was not merely ornament. A thick curtain over a doorway could blunt a draft more effectively than a noble intention ever would. A cushion, bench cover, or padded hanging could make the difference between a surface that stole warmth and one that merely received the body. Carpets or floor coverings, even partial ones, mattered because the ground was often a silent enemy in winter. Medieval people understood, through experience rather than theory, that softness could be thermally useful. Wool, fur, layering, pile, and trapped air all helped mediate the hostility of hard materials. This is one reason inventories and household records can seem so full of fabric. Beds, hangings, coverlets, blankets, cushions, wall cloths, bench covers, canopies, screens. To modern eyes, it may look like a taste for decorative abundance. Often it was that, but it was also a way of domestic softening. Stone, timber, and cold air were being answered with weave, padding, and drape. Elite interiors, especially in winter, might therefore feel less like bare architecture than like layered textile climates built inside architecture. Remove the hangings, the rugs, the bed curtains, and the room might quickly seem much more honest about how cold it really was. Screens and partitions deserve attention too. In large or drafty interiors, temporary barriers could be used to create smaller thermal zones. A screen near the fire, a hanging dividing sleeping space, or furniture arranged to block air currents could reshape how warmth moved. Again, the goal was rarely to conquer the whole room. It was to create a more manageable microenvironment. Medieval people were very good at this sort of localized problem solving. They did not waste effort trying to heat all empty air equally if the body only occupied a small part of it. Even table arrangements could reflect this logic. In winter, work and meals often clustered where heat and light coincided best. A bench pulled nearer the fire, a stool shifted to avoid draft, a tabletop position to benefit from a brazier or window during the week's central hours of daylight. The arrangement of objects in a room was not neutral. It changed with the season, and because many rooms had to serve multiple purposes, this meant the house itself was in a kind of low, constant motion, reorganized subtly around the search for warmth. Travel generated its own set of portable solutions. Thick cloaks, fur linings, gloves or mittens, leggings, riding rugs, and wrapped footwear all served as mobile insulation. Travelers sometimes carried heated objects for short use before departure or upon arrival, though the road itself remained a place where warmth was hardest to hold. Saddles chilled. Wet weather invaded seams. Metal fittings touched coldly through gloves. The horse or mule might offer movement-generated warmth, but not enough to spare the rider's feet or face from winter air. So medieval travel gear often seems redundant to modern eyes. Layers on layers, cloth over leather over wool, fur over cloth, hoods beneath cloaks. But that redundancy was the point. The road stripped warmth quickly. Protection had to be cumulative. There is also a revealing contrast between warming devices for the house and warming devices for institutions. In monasteries, churches, hospitals, and some civic settings, the problem of localized warmth could become highly structured. A warming room in a monastery, a heated area in an infirmary, braziers in communal use, warmed stones or pans in more disciplined circulation. These all show how institutions rationed heat. Warmth was not simply supplied. It was allocated according to need, rule, status, or function. The device itself may have been humble, but the system governing it could be highly social. And that leads to another interesting point. Many warming tools required skill to use well. The warming pan had to be judged for heat. The brick must not crack or scorch. The brazier must not smother the room. The bed curtains must retain heat without creating excessive damp or discomfort. Even hanging a tapestry or screen effectively required an understanding of where the draft really came from. Medieval winter knowledge was practical and cumulative. It belonged to servants, housewives, craftsmen, innkeepers, monks, wet nurses, old people, and anyone else who had spent enough winters learning the house with their body. That embodied knowledge is easy to underrate because it rarely arrives dressed as theory. It survives in habits, objects, and practical arrangements more often than in grand explanations. Yet it may have been one of the most important forms of domestic intelligence in the period. To know how long to heat the bed warmer. To know which room held warmth best after sunset. To know when to shut the shutters, how much ash to place over embers, whether the child's side of the bed needed another covering, whether the kitchen heat could be borrowed for drying, whether the old dog should be allowed nearer the fire on a particularly bitter night. These are not trivial judgments. They are the decisions by which households preserved comfort and sometimes health. And because so much depended on them, failures could be memorable. The bed too hot in one place and still cold in another. The brazier that smoked badly. The cloak that remained damp by morning. The brick that cooled too fast. The tapestry that helped little because the wind found another crack. Medieval warming devices did not create effortless comfort. They created a constant cycle of adjustment. The householder was always learning from the season and revising accordingly. It is tempting, at this point, to see medieval winter technology as endearing improvisation, all clever patches and earnest workarounds. But that would be slightly misleading. Some of these methods were genuinely effective within their limits. A well-prepared bed, a thick textile interior, a carefully managed brazier, a properly banked hearth, and good winter clothing could make a substantial difference. The real problem was not ignorance. It was that the energy available remained limited, expensive, dirty, or dangerous to move around. Medieval people had plenty of practical intelligence. What they lacked was the invisible abundance of safe, distributed heat that later centuries would slowly build. This is why the little technologies matter so much. They show a world pushing at the boundary of its own material possibilities. Heat could be carried, stored briefly, enclosed, reflected, concentrated, or trapped in layers. It could not yet be piped cleanly into every corner of a building. So the medieval household developed a culture of partial solutions, and partial solutions are often where human ingenuity is most visible. The same ingenuity can be seen in furniture. High-back chairs, settles, enclosed benches, and curtained seats in some later contexts did more than define status or style. They altered air movement around the sitter. To place wood or textile behind the body was to reduce the drain of cold from wall and draft. Similarly, the position of the bed, not directly against the worst wall if it could be helped, not in the most exposed current, perhaps elevated slightly or enclosed, shows how furniture placement could serve as a warming technology in itself. Even a chest, placed strategically, might cut a troublesome draft. One of the more subtle medieval habits was therefore not a single device at all, but the habit of thermal arrangement. Rooms were read almost like weather. People learned where the floor felt colder, where the wind entered, where the wall breathed chill, where the fire reached well, where it did not, where smoke gathered, where a bench remained tolerable longest after the flames sank. This reading of space was likely second nature to many people, and because it was second nature, they may not have described it often. But their objects, and the surviving logic of their homes, suggest it clearly enough. There was also the question of moisture. Heat stored in stone or fabric worked differently in a dry room than in a damp one. Bedding left slightly wet, a wall that wickeded moisture, rushes that trapped damp, fuel that had not fully seasoned, or clothing that never properly dried could all sabotage the household's best efforts. So some warming technologies were really drying technologies in disguise. Items were placed near the fire not only to warm but to drive out moisture. Linen aired, shoes dried, cloaks hung carefully, bedclothes were turned back or shaken. A room that felt less wet often felt warmer even before the fire itself intensified. This makes the medieval winter interior feel, in a strange way, almost alive with low-level thermal tasks. Things are always being moved nearer, drawn back, turned over, shaken out, wrapped up, loosened, reheated, protected from sparks, protected from damp, or brought from one room to another. The warming device is rarely isolated from the household system. It belongs to a choreography of hands and timing. Some of the strangest-looking devices in the medieval and near-medieval world emerge precisely from this choreography. Enclosed foot stoves tucked beneath robes. Small perforated containers for coals. Bed warmers with elaborate lids meant to contain ash more safely. Thickly padded coverings that could be tied, layered, or doubled according to the weather. There is often something slightly awkward about them, especially compared with the clean abstraction of modern radiators or hidden vents. They insist on their physicality. They have handles, hinges, holes, ashes, smells, and risks. One uses them with the whole body, not by pressing a switch. And that awkwardness may be why they feel so memorable. They reveal the medieval relationship with heat as something tactile and negotiated. One lifted warmth, carried it, judged it, feared it, and sat with it. It stained fabrics, warmed hands, threatened accidents, comforted the sick, made prayer possible, and let tired travelers sleep. Heat was not background utility. It was a companion that demanded management. Even the simplest domestic advice would have reflected this. Keep the child away from the brazier. Do not place the warmer too near the linen. Turn the brick once more. Close that hanging. Move the stool back a little. Feed the fire now, not later. Bring the blanket nearer the hearth. Check the embers before bed. These are the instructions of a world where winter comfort existed only through continued attention, so the strange ways medieval people tried to stay warm were not truly strange in the sense of being whimsical. They were strange because they belonged to a materially different world, one in which comfort had edges, devices had personalities, and every room was full of micro-decisions. The object that looks quaint in isolation, a warming pan, a brazier, a heated stone, makes full sense only when restored to the human situation around it. The smoky chamber, the damp cloak, the cold boards, the old woman's hands, the child already asleep, the servant crossing the room carefully so as not to spill ash, the traveler waiting for the sheets to lose their first shock of cold. And once we see these objects properly, another layer of the story begins to open. Because technologies of warmth were never only about survival or bodily ease. They also changed behavior, privacy, etiquette, and even the emotional tone of rooms. A bed that could be warmed in advance became a different sort of refuge. A private chamber with portable heat encouraged retreat from communal halls. A curtained seat or enclosed chair altered how people sat together and apart. In other words, these awkward little winter tools did not just answer the cold. They slowly reshaped medieval domestic life itself, drawing people away from some older communal habits and toward more selective, more managed forms of comfort. Drawing people away from some older communal habits and toward more selective, more managed forms of comfort, medieval winter warmth was never just a matter of feeling less cold. It quietly changed the shape of home itself. A world organized once more fully around the common hall, and the great fire gradually made room for smaller chambers, thicker hangings, more private beds, and more personal forms of heating. That change did not happen everywhere at once, and it did not erase the old communal patterns. But over time, the search for warmth helped encourage a broader search for enclosure, privacy, and controllable domestic space. That is one of the reasons this subject lingers in the mind. At first it seems almost charming. Bed warmers, fur cloaks, smoky hearths, families huddled beneath blankets. But the deeper we go, the clearer it becomes that medieval people were living inside a constant negotiation with matter itself. Stone, wool, ash, peat, damp wood, animal heat, bed curtains, hot broth, layered clothing, and human closeness all had to be arranged with care. Warmth was not ambient. It was assembled. It had to be made, protected, shared, and sometimes rationed. And because it had to be rationed, winter revealed truths that summer could partly conceal. It revealed who had servants and who did not, who could afford fur and who relied on patched wool, who slept alone in a prepared bed and who slept pressed against others because cold left little choice, who had access to dry fuel, enclosed rooms, thick textiles, and restful heat, and who woke each morning to the harder task of restarting life in a room that had surrendered to the night. In that sense, the medieval struggle to stay warm was never merely domestic. It was social, economic, and moral, written directly onto the body. It also reveals something gentler and perhaps more enduring. For all the hardship, inconvenience, and inequality, there was a remarkable steadiness in the way people answered the cold. They observed, they adapted, they layered, carried, banked, wrapped, enclosed, and improvised. They made use of small comforts with a seriousness modern life can sometimes forget. A warmed brick, a drawn bed curtain, a bowl of hot pottage, a bench turned closer to the fire, a child placed in the safest part of the bed, a cloak dried carefully for morning. These were not trivial acts. They were the daily craftsmanship of survival and sometimes of care. That may be the deepest correction this history offers. Medieval people did not endure winter because they were indifferent to comfort. They endured it because they understood comfort as something fragile, local, and worth working for. A little warmth was meaningful precisely because it was hard-won. The hearth was not symbolic because fire looked pretty. It was symbolic because it marked the place where effort, shelter, labor, and belonging met. To be brought near it was to be included in a human circle against the season outside. And once you begin to see that, many of the so-called strange practices stop seeming strange at all. Sleeping together, warming stones, carrying braziers, hanging thick textiles, living close to animals, dressing in layers indoors, banking embers through the night. None of it was absurd. It was rational within the limits people had. Medieval winter was a world before effortless background comfort, and so its people met cold not with one great invention, but with 1,000 careful adjustments. Their ingenuity was small-scale, repetitive, and intimate, which is often the kind of ingenuity history overlooks. even though it is the kind most people have relied on for most of human time. Perhaps that is why this story can feel unexpectedly close. Modern viewers live with central heating, insulated walls, sealed windows, electric blankets, hot water on demand, and rooms whose temperature barely changes from 1 hour to the next. It takes only a moment's thought to realize how radically unusual that really is. For medieval people, winter was never fully kept outside. It entered the wall, the floor, the bed, the shoe, the breath. It shaped posture, appetite, sleep, architecture, hierarchy, and habit. To stay warm was not a seasonal luxury. It was one of the great organizing challenges of life. And yet there is something almost peaceful in the precision of their answers. Not easy, certainly, not romantic, but precise. They knew the warmest corner of a room, the best time to shut the shutters, the right depth of ash over embers, the thickness of cloth needed for a child, the difference between a tolerable draft and a miserable one, the relief a curtain could bring, the comfort of broth after exposure, the warning smell of overheated fabric, the particular mercy of a bed that had been prepared before entering it. This was knowledge carried in hands and bodies, passed across generations not because it was quaint, but because winter kept asking the same old question. How do you make a little island of warmth in a world that does not give it freely? The medieval answer, in the end, was never one thing. It was the house, the fire, the cloth, the bed, the meal, the animal, the servant, the mother, the monk, the craftsman, the traveler, the host. It was architecture and improvisation. It was hierarchy and tenderness. It was smoke in the rafters and warmth under the blanket. It was discomfort endured and comfort protected. It was, above all, a way of living that treated heat as precious and closeness as practical. So the next time the idea of medieval winter appears in the mind as something picturesque, a glowing hall, a snowy village, a fur-lined cloak, it may be worth remembering the fuller picture beneath it. The cold stone underfoot, the dampness in the air, the labor behind every log, the body turning slowly toward the fire, the bed still cold at first touch, the small technologies passed from hearth to chamber, the long night waiting outside the shutters, and inside, people doing what human beings have always done when the world becomes inhospitable, gathering what warmth they can and trying to make it last. If there was one detail in all of this that surprised you most, or one part of medieval winter life that felt hardest to imagine living through, I'd love to hear it. And if you'd like to return for more calm, thoughtful journeys into the past, subscribe and join me again for the next one.